name is Chet Crocker, and I am chairing this panel on building civilian capacity to meet 21st century challenges. A few introductory words, and then I will say a word about, a very brief word about each of our panelists. I'll keep it very brief because the bios are all in your packets, and they're very well done, and they're very eloquent, and they provide considerable detail about the career trajectory of everybody who's speaking here, so I'm going to keep it very brief. I think many of us assume that we need to improve the civilian capacity for managing various dimensions of external intervention and external assistance in conflict environments. But there will need to be some international division of effort in this vast enterprise. No single institution or country can do everything. More important, I think we need to be clear, and this panel will shed some light, I'm certain, on this question, about civilian capacity to do what? I don't think there will be much enthusiasm in many countries for ramping up greater capacity to invade, administer, and occupy foreign lands for long periods of time in order to change regimes or sort out ill-governed societies. But there will be enthusiasm for a lot of other things, for creating a robust civilian capacity to lead the way in developing and deploying political solutions in violent conflict situations, and for linking up mediation efforts with others who are also engaged, for monitoring security and humanitarian crises of various kinds and devising responses, guiding the provision of emergency and development assistance, and coordinating initiatives to advance security sector reform and training in the rule of law. Our panelists are well qualified to address all of those agendas. The U.S. Institute of Peace, and I wanted to emphasize this point, is very keenly interested in the output of this panel. We are building at the Institute a school for practitioners drawn from a wide range of institutions, U.S. and foreign, civilian and military, official and non-official. We believe that people from these different institutions, professionals, mid-career, starting out, maybe even senior people, will need to do joint training so that they are more able to operate effectively in conflict zones. The courses that we are now establishing will fill a major gap in the availability of training opportunities for professionals interested in best practice in these different fields. And of course, I'd like to recognize Pamela All, who directs the Domestic Education and Training Program here at USIP, who's sitting right in the front row, and who has been developing the pilot courses that are now becoming real courses in a whole variety of different fields. And sitting next to her is Mike Lexon, who directs our training program for international. So for those of you who have any questions about where we're going in this training enterprise of ours, come forward afterwards and have your conversations. Again, I'm not going to read the panelists' bios. I'm going to go alphabetically in terms of just saying a word and ask speakers to speak alphabetically, starting with Jim Dobbins. Jim directs the RAND Corporation's International Security and Defense Policy Center and has managed a few peace and stability operations in his time. Jim will briefly describe what the U.S. lessons learned are in this vast field. He's produced quite a series of studies in this area, and we're asking him to focus primarily on the U.S. lessons. I will then turn alphabetically to Jean-Marie Guéhenno, who is a veteran French career diplomat and international civil servant whose most recent posting was as Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping, as you all know. And we've asked Jean-Marie to focus his remarks on the lessons learned in the UN system. And when I say lessons learned, I mean not only in terms of best practice, but also training needs. What are the skill sets that we are trying to develop more of in the international system? And thirdly, Nancy Lindborg, who is president of Mercy Corps, a leading relief and development organization with operations all over the world, in many regions. Nancy will address the lessons learned from the perspective of lessons in the non-governmental, non-official sector for all the different kinds of relief and development challenges that are faced from the standpoint of that community. So without further word, Jim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ed. Anyone observing the American performance in Iraq over the first year of the American occupation could be forgiven for thinking that this was the first time we'd ever done something like this. It was one unexpected challenge after another. It was one improvised response after another. In fact, of course, it wasn't the first time. In fact, it was the 7th time in little more than a decade that the United States had liberated a society and then tried to rebuild it. So in the early 90s, the United States liberated Kuwait, and in the subsequent years it went into Somalia, into Haiti, into Bosnia, into Kosovo, into Afghanistan, and finally into Iraq. And of those 7 societies, 6 are Muslim. The only one that's not a Muslim society is Haiti. So when the United States went into Iraq in 2003, there was no country in the world with more experience in nation building. And there was no country in the world with more experience in nation building within Muslim societies than the United States. And so you do have to ask yourself how we can do this so often and yet do it so badly. And the answer was we simply weren't taking this mission seriously. We didn't regard it as a core national competency. Despite the increasing frequency of the missions, we were treating each of them as if it was the first one we'd ever done. And worse than that, we were treating each of them as if it was the last one we were ever going to do. And at the conclusion, we were dispersing the expertise. We weren't creating an ongoing doctrine, and we weren't creating a cadre of experts capable of executing these kinds of missions. Now, the growth in American nation building over this period wasn't an isolated phenomenon. The growth in UN missions of similar import was even more startling. During the Cold War, the United States intervened in a new country about once every 10 years. And in the aftermath of the Cold War, that went from once every 10 years to once every 2 years. During the Cold War, the UN mounted a new peacekeeping mission on an average of once every 4 years. Since 1989, it mounts a new peacekeeping mission in a new country every 6 months. So this exponential growth is not a phenomenon of American policy particularly. It's a growth in demand for these kinds of services. I think while the Bush administration wasn't particularly keen to draw attention to its early failures, I think to its credit it did recognize them, and it has taken a number of very important corrective measures. And you've seen institutional changes in the State Department, in the Defense Department, and the administration as a whole, designed to do this kind of mission better in the future. So in the Defense Department, a directive was issued by the Secretary of Defense making what it calls stability operations, which is their name for nation building, a core mission of the U.S. military. This would have been a radical measure in the 1990s. Bill Clinton would have been impeached if he tried to do something like this, but by the middle of this decade, it passed without significant notice. The State Department actually created, for the first time in 15 years, an office, the purpose of which is to improve the conduct of American stability and reconstruction operations, to do just the things we weren't doing during the previous decade. That is, create an ongoing doctrine for the conduct of these kinds of missions and build a cadre of experts. And finally, the White House established an interagency structure to manage these kinds of operations. Clinton had done the same thing. The new administration, when it came into office, had suppressed the Clinton mechanism without replacing it. But in 2005, a new structure was put in place. And I think you do see improved performance. If you look at American performance in Iraq in 2007, 2008, you see a much better blending of civilian and American capacity, a much more appropriate set of military and civilian responses, and a highly successful counterinsurgency strategy that has made remarkable progress in returning stability and also promoting reconstruction in that country. There are, however, still a good deal that can be done in this regard, and there is room for considerable improvement. Now, there are a number of proposals, any number of commissions and prestigious groups have come and put forward suggestions for renewing or revamping or reorganizing the U.S. government with respect to these kinds of issues. I tend to be a minimalist in this regard. That is to say, I don't particularly favor a new agency that does reconstruction. I don't particularly favor a substantially increased White House staff to oversee these kinds of operations. But I do think that we do need to improve the professionalism with which we conduct operations, and we need to bolster the mechanisms that we primarily rely on for performing the non-military components of these missions, which is, in my judgment, specifically USAID. I favor a three-tier structure for running the U.S. government, not just in this, but in other spheres, in which the White House sets and coordinates policy. The State Department makes sure that all programs that are conducted internationally support that policy. So it coordinates the programs that are conducted by the Department of Defense, the Department of Treasury, AID, or other programs. At the national level, the ambassador does that. At the local level, that is, and internationally, that's a State Department function. But actually conducting those programs is not something that the State Department's particularly good at. And I would strip the State Department of many of the programmatic elements that it has gradually accrued at the expense of other agencies, in particular of USAID. There's a general view that we need to bolster AID. There's also a recognition we don't have a lot of money, and there's not much interest in putting more money into foreign aid, and therefore it's going to be very difficult to do. I think it can be done very simply by simply putting back into AID all of the things that have been stripped out of it in the last 30 years, which would create a large, substantial bureaucracy with a basis of expertise across a spectrum of activities. This would include all of the refugee work done in the State Department. It would include all the police training done in the State Department. It would include the Millennium Development Program, which has been taken out of AID. It would include assistance to AIDS and other endemic diseases, which have been taken out of AID. And I think if those were all put back in AID, you'd have a robust agency which would have a core of expertise which could be directed to national priorities as they emerge. So I do think that there's scope for further improvement in this regard. And I think the State Department's current focus on building a ready reserve of citizens and officials who are prepared to take off from their day jobs for relatively brief periods to serve in places like Bosnia or Kosovo or Afghanistan or Iraq, while it's helpful on the margins, isn't going to go very far because the numbers that actually can be generated are limited. And I would propose spending a lot more money on that only once we'd had an adequate basis of full-time civil servants who could fill these positions, and there's clearly a significant shortage of those. So I think that the Bush administration's response to the early failures in Afghanistan and Iraq was a determination that we need to do better next time. And I think they deserve credit for that. I'd also note, however, that that's not necessarily the conclusion that many American congressmen and many American citizens have come to. Indeed, many Americans have probably come to the conclusion that we better not do this again next time. And there is, I think, a possibility that we'll go through a sort of a post-Vietnam, never-again phenomenon. After Vietnam, we forgot everything we'd learned about counterinsurgency and had to spend half a decade relearning it when we found ourselves involved in other rather similar insurgencies. And we could go through the same kind of phenomenon in the area of nation-building and stability operations as well. So I think one of the main questions I have is whether the American people, based on the frustrations they've experienced in Iraq and our experience in Afghanistan, can come to two separate conclusions. You know, one is, yes, let's not invade any more large, hostile Middle East countries on the basis of flawed intelligence with very narrow, non-representative coalitions. That's a good lesson. But if Iraq was a war of choice, and the choice was a poor one, Afghanistan really wasn't. And both of those commitments left us with very substantial nation-building burdens. And so even if you abstract Iraq out of the equation and look back at the experience over the last 15 years, you're going to find from Kuwait to Somalia to Haiti to Bosnia to Kosovo to Afghanistan an enduring requirement for developing these kinds of skills. And we still have not adequately institutionalized the basis by which we make that a national competency.
Thank you very much, Jim. Jean-Marie, I'll turn the floor over to you to give us a perspective from New York and elsewhere around the world.
Thank you. Well, since 1999, when the missions in Timor and Kosovo were launched, I think there have been a lot of lessons learned. Maybe the first the first lesson is a lesson of humility. That is, 1999 is a sense that when a country is broken, you just run it. And that the UN can be the new sort of colonial power. And I think the more one looks at those situations, the more one sees that the UN flag may be a little more legitimate than a national flag. But the notion that foreigners can run a country, the notion of trusteeship as an answer to problems of fragile states, I think the more one looks at it, the more one sees that it's overambitious. The resources will not be there, and the acceptance will not be there, and the legitimacy will not be there. Because the key is the acceptance. The first lesson is really political. You will succeed if you have political support. Now, moving to the technical issues. I think one lesson that we have learned is that the issue of orchestration of the effort is fundamental. I happen to think that the UN setup, with all its limitations and its imperfections, especially in the execution, but the notion that there is a civilian representative on the ground who orchestrates both the civilian and the military effort without pretending to be a general, and that relationship between the civilian leader and the military component has to be managed in a very careful manner. But the notion that on the ground you have someone who orchestrates the whole effort, I think is a good one, because you are in a very difficult position to help a country if you do not get the political-military relationship right. And you can only get it right if you are right in the theater. You can't get it right from thousands of miles away. I think you have a problem. So I think that setup is right. And another lesson is that the head of the civilian effort has indeed a very big job, because he has to work on several fronts. He has to mobilize the international community in support of a spoiler strategy, so to speak, to prevent spoilers from derailing a process. That means he also has to work on the regional dimension, because no conflict will be solved if the region is not managed. And we see it in Iraq, we see it in Congo, we see it in many places. So that's another lesson. Then when one looks at the various functions that need to be performed, I think after 10 years of successes and failures, the list of the critical issues is pretty straightforward. At the heart, there is the politics, because if you don't get the politics right, if you do not have the right political advisors, if you do not have the right political team to lead the effort on the ground, all the technical support, aid that you will give, well, it's nice, but it won't. You'll not make peace just by providing technical aid. So the political cluster, with the political advice at the national level, at the local level, with the constitutional and the electoral advice. And electoral advice, not just in terms of how do you run an election, but what kind of election will be less divisive, because an election is a very dangerous moment. That is a critical cluster. Then the security cluster, because in a way it all flows from the basic mission statement that we are deployed in a fragile state to help reestablish the monopoly of the state on the legitimate use of force. And so that means you have to address all those people who have guns, and you want to remove the guns from them. And that's the whole disarmament, demobilization, reintegration effort. How you do it, it's not a technical issue, it's a highly political issue. You have to address how you create a new security force, both the military and the police. And there, if you can't be quickly on the ground, if you do not have a rapid deployment capacity to shape things right from the outset, you have a problem. And as you address the police, I think one of the lessons that we have learned is that the best is to mix, including for the purely police segment of rule of law, is to mix uniformed personnel and civilian personnel, because if you help reestablish a Ministry of Interior, you need to have a support structure, you need to have a vetting system, you need to have an administration, so you need to think in a comprehensive way on how you're going to establish that institution. And you need also to think of the police not in isolation. You need, and that's why in the UN we created in peacekeeping an Office of Rule of Law and Security Institutions to precisely combine police, judiciary, corrections, and security reform in a broader sense. Because if you don't do that, it's like having a chair with one leg missing. If you have police but you don't have a judiciary focused in the early stages on the criminal law and maybe some land issues, you're not going to address everything. But if you don't have that, the police will have no framework. And if you don't have corrections, you create a problem for yourself as you lock up people and you have no national institutions to deal with the problem. So these are key institutions. There's another cluster which I think is critical. It's the financial cluster, so to speak. Because unless the international community is prepared to underwrite the budget of a fragile country in an open-ended manner, you need to quickly help that country create a solid revenue base and control its spending chain. If you don't have that, you have also a fundamental problem. And lastly, what I would call the administrative cluster, working at both ends. At the top end, the cabinet. We see it in Afghanistan, I've seen it in Congo, I've seen it in many places. The whole issue of how the national state structure is able to function and prioritize so that the plans of the country are not a juxtaposition of plans developed by various foreign agencies. So that you help build a national interlocutor which can set the priorities for itself. And that has a lot to do with the cabinet process at the top. And at the bottom, then it's the whole issue of local administration. Now, what does that mean in terms of training? We send police officers, civilian experts, who, for many of them, have never been in a conflict zone. And it's very different to be a police officer in Paris or New York or Washington, or to be a police officer in Kisangani or Kandahar. It's radically different. And if you're not prepared for that, if you're not being trained also to transfer knowledge, not just to be a good police officer, you're going to function at 5% of your capacity. And so I think one of the big gaps that we have today is that we throw people who may have the national expertise in there, who would be just fine as police officers or judiciary or this or that in a national context, but they are thrown into a situation that they don't really know how to deal with. And it is, to be fair, very difficult to deal with those situations because you need a balance of empathy, listening, and at the same time not being a pushover, and that requires some training. Second issue on training, I think we get a lot too many people who are fine experts who have no sense of operations. I'm finishing in a second. I have just one third point. We need not just experts, we need people who know how to run things and to transfer that knowledge. And thirdly, and that's linked to the security sector reform and all these idle people that you find in a post-conflict situation, we're very bad at developing capacities to generate quick economic growth with job creation. And that requires more thought. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. And that's a perfect segue, I think, Nancy, for your remarks. So over to you. Great.
Thank you. Nice to be here. And I'll try to be complimentary in some of the things that I have to say and draw on the experience from a non-governmental organization's perspective and our sector, which I think has been increasingly involved over the past decade in many, many of these environments. Many of the 7 that Jim ticked off as the big ones. But there are others as well. And when we think about working in conflict and on conflict areas, you know, it's a whole broader list of failed and fragile environments in which we have these similar challenges. And one of the things that we consider over and over again, I think, is are we talking about the Afghanistans and the Iraqs of the world, or do we also need to consider the Somalias, the Sudans, all the places where there isn't currently a more active military presence? And that, I think, lends additional urgency to the need to enhance and increase our civilian capacity. Our other 2 speakers haven't mentioned the need for rebalancing some of the funding streams, besides Jim's rather pessimistic comment that he doesn't think there will be appetite for that. But I hope that there is indeed an opportunity to think about additional funding for foreign assistance, the international affairs budget, to address some of the needs to do the kind of planning and the kind of training in the civilian sector that the military has the great luxury of doing. As we look at how to be most effective in these conflict and post-conflict environments, we really still divide it into conflict relief and then the development boxes. And what we haven't done structurally, nor do I think programmatically, is really think in a more fluid way about these transitional environments. And what does that mean both programmatically, funding authorities and structures? What we have found in so many of these environments, especially if you do have a peace treaty or some at least temporary conclusion to the conflict, is you do have this moment, this sort of golden hour, golden year in many cases. We certainly saw that in Afghanistan and Iraq. How do you consolidate those gains, and how do you bring forward the flexibility of funding that enables you to move as quickly as the contextual environment allows you to do? So a couple of things that, from a kind of structural policy approach, that I would flag is, first of all, I hope we learn different lessons than the provincial reconstruction teams, which seem to be emerging from both Iraq and Afghanistan. As we look at the roles of civilian actors and the roles of the military, I would actually refer back to some of the comments that Mr. Zellick made at lunch today. It's critical to secure the environment, to create ambient security within which development and those transitional pathways to peace can occur. It does matter, I think, who conducts the development activities, and you'll achieve different objectives with a hearts and minds strategy than you will with a development strategy. So how you construct the environment within which people can do that will make a big difference. I think there's often not enough emphasis on perimeter security, on main roads or borders, or the kinds of things that could create a better environment for security. And as Mr. Zellick said, numbers matter. As we look forward at the whole of government approaches, I think all of us agree that there needs to be better coordination, and there needs to be clear understanding of how all the actors contribute to an objective of peace and stability in an environment. But we also need to understand how you can undermine the capacities of certain actors by making it too tightly coordinated of a team. And very specifically with the provincial reconstruction team approach, when you have a barricaded environment within which state actors are working, the more you try to pull your non-governmental partners into that barricaded environment, or even your civilian state actors, the more you undermine their ability to do the kind of development work that can be the most effective and needs to happen as quickly as possible in any of these environments. When you are out working with communities, it matters if you're retreating at night to a barricaded environment or able to stay out and working more freely with them. And that'll lead to some training, to a training agenda in just a moment. The related principle to this is the importance of community-led approaches as a complement to some of the government capacity approaches that my colleagues have mentioned, that you need to have ownership at the community level as well as at the national level. And again, that goes to the kinds of civilian capacities and understandings of how development can occur as we look at the future. You need the center fringe, and you need the top and the bottom. All of these development approaches working hand in hand in parallel. Too often what we see is you lurch from one to the other. It's all investment in development at the national level, and then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, we got to do the provincial and the local levels, where you really need those to be proceeding from the beginning, especially during that sort of golden year where often you have more latitude, more confidence of the population, so that they can proceed at the same time. In terms of, I completely agree with Jim in terms of lodging the expeditionary, if you will, capacities within USAID, providing additional funding there, And I would look there to create mechanisms that involve more flexibility, so that when you're putting programs out into the field, the people who are implementing them have the ability to be flexible, so that you're able to shift with the environment and not get stuck in plans that have been made back at a center somewhere, and create that ability for community-led ownership. What does this mean in terms of a training agenda? First of all, there needs to be additional training around planning and being able to, within the civilian sector, do the kind of planning that the military has the extraordinary luxury to do. And I won't bore everyone with quoting that military band statistic, but it's about the military. The USAID has fewer people than the military band, but I mean that's it's a sobering thing when we think about the lack of planning capacity that we have and the training that goes along with that. So I would put that very high on anyone's training list. Secondly, I would agree with the need for a negotiation training approach. When you're putting people in conflict environments, they need to be better equipped to negotiate with the many, many actors with whom they'll interact. We both, throughout that Reconstruction period, you often need to negotiate checkpoints, clan elders, militias, all kinds of folks who are critical to the enterprise and with whom you need to deal and to deal effectively. Also, to be able to transmit those negotiation techniques often to those local structures to support their ability to solve problems at a local level. Thirdly, I would emphasize remote management, which is a variation of the management agenda, but oftentimes when things get hot, the answer is not to go and install a barricaded facility from which to conduct operations, but rather to train your local teams to conduct the development programs and then to have the remote management techniques to enable you to liaise with them most effectively and to manage the ongoing program. Thirdly, conflict analysis, so that all the civilian actors understand all of the small conflicts that occur on an ongoing basis. It's not just the big conflicts that we have to worry about. It's land use disputes. It's the this clan against that clan. It's resource scarcity where people are going to battle and conflicts will erupt. And being able to understand those root causes so you can design the kind of programs that don't allow those to flame up and become center stage as you try to move towards peace and stability. So I would end with the need to focus very strongly on the economic approaches early on, and to do so not just at the macro level, but at the community level, so that people have an ability to invest in their own future and to support their families with dignity as a critical ingredient of creating both constituents for stability and reform and also constituents for a governance that enables their own businesses to go forward. And that's a huge piece that needs to go hand in hand as quickly as possible after a security approach. Thanks.
I'd like to thank all three of our panelists, and I'm going to now open this up for a few minutes of Q&A. And we have mics. Don't ask your question until the mic comes to you. And please identify yourself very briefly, and no speeches. What I'm going to do is collect three or four questions and then come back to the panel so we have more efficient use of the time. I see a hand right here, sir. If a mic could come to this gentleman here, that would be great. If you stand up, a mic will come to you. The next questioner in the back, who is standing up now, will get the mic. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Don Kirsch from the Institute for Defense Analyses. Throughout the day, there's been a lot of comment and I think common agreement on the need for a greater civilian capacity within the U.S. government to respond to stability and reconstruction operations, but so much of this seems to be taking place in a vacuum where we think about how we coordinate the U.S. effort. I would like to take the advantage of the presence of a UN rep to see how our new administration might do a better job in making this a part of a broader international effort and coordinating with international institutions and other donors.
Thank you. So the question is international coordination and working with others. Yes, in the back.
Thanks. My name is Dan Consolator. I work for a small firm called McKellar Corporation. We support the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, who've asked us to look at how DoD might support interagency training, especially of civilians, and really develop really whole-of-government integrated training programs and take advantage of its greater resources. I know that might be somewhat controversial, and the suggestion might be that they should stay away from that, and funding should simply go straight to the civilians. But I wonder if, especially Mr. Dobbins, would like to talk about how DoD might leverage its resources to provide training.
Okay, I see a question right here.
My name's Claudine Schweber. I'm at the University of Maryland. It seems to me a lot of the discussions so far had to do with needing to have a systems perspective that is looking at varying parts of how they all fit together. And what sometimes is missing is the feedback loop. That is, you have a project and you say, let's look and see how it worked in 6 months or a year and make changes. I ask you whether you have any examples of where there was, in fact, a feedback loop built into whatever you were doing, and that changes were made, or what you were doing was then confirmed as what you intended to accomplish.
Thank you. And there's one more right here in the front. Yes, sir. And I'll take that, and then we'll go back to the panel.
With the Executive Intelligence Review. This question is directed towards the second speaker. Taking advantage of the fact that you mentioned the question of finance, it is important that a reconstruction policy is set forth, but especially if you see the current bailout policy that was passed with the Congress earlier this year, it's pretty clear that we don't have a financial system which could do something of that sort. So wouldn't you think that a better approach would be to first reorganize the current bankrupt bank system and set up something new?
Okay, thank you. Who would like to start? Jim, there was a question that was headed your way. I think there was one that could go between Nancy and Jean-Marie, several for Jean-Marie.
Well, let me try to say some things that apply to most of these questions. First of all, as the U.S. looks to improve its own capabilities, it's important to do so in ways that make it easier rather than harder to leverage everybody else's abilities, to leverage the UN and other contributors. And that means establishing mechanisms within the U.S. government that are compatible with the mechanisms everybody else has is very important. If we decide that our military is going to train police, and every other country in the world has its civilians training police, we're creating a serious barrier to collective programs to conduct that kind of activity. And that's just one example. So we have to be conscious of how the UN does it, how other countries do it, and there are trade-offs. If we decide it's more efficient for us to put it in a different agency of the U.S. government, fine. What we have to understand is we're degrading our capability to leverage other countries. And while in Iraq we haven't been successful largely for other reasons and not leveraging anybody else, we have to remember that in Bosnia we only provided 25% of the money and the troops. And in Kosovo we only provided 16%. And the other 80 or 75 or 80% were provided by other allies. And so it was important for our components to slot in with other components. So establishing mechanisms of the U.S. government that are compatible with others is important for international integration. On feedback loops, I mean, I think that there are built-in feedback loops that work, but they only work up to a point. During the Clinton administration, they clearly got better over 8 years. If you look at Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, and Kosovo, each operation was conducted more professionally with less screw-ups. I mean, Somalia was a pretty low, base to start with. Nevertheless, it was a steady improvement, and then it didn't carry over to the next administration. And it didn't carry over because it was largely lodged in the people who were doing it repeatedly, and they all left. And a new administration came in dedicated to not doing anything the last administration had done, and therefore had to make all the mistakes over again. And there's a serious danger we'll repeat that again. So more continuity. If you're looking for a place to fix the U.S. government, it's largely at the transition point, because that's where a lot of expertise is lost. Another problem is that functions keep switching between agencies. If you can fix who's going to do a particular function, that in a way that transitions from one administration to the next, that agency will get better. But if a new administration comes in and says, state trained the police in this, now DOD is going to train the police, or any other function, and there have been many examples, then no one ever gets better. Because every 2 or 3 years, some new agency has inherited this function because people are dissatisfied with the way the old agency was conducting the function. And it could be that some legislation is important in that regard. Now, we've seen important improvements in the Bush administration's performance over the last 8 years. And in Iraq, over the last 2 years, you've seen an accrued improvement, largely as the result of feedback loops, which the DOD is actually very good at. DOD is the only agency that actually pays people to critique its performance, something the State Department has never even thought of, and that actually uses that material. And so you saw a remarkable improvement in performance as a result of a feedback loop. Partially it was just the whole world was telling them they were doing a terrible job, but partly it was because they actually studied it, spent money to have people tell them how to do it better, and then took advantage of those lessons.
Okay. Nancy.
A couple of responses. On the systems approach, I would add to that, you need the feedback loop, not just on how's the system working, but how's it working for the people in those communities and in that country. And I think that's what we often underinvest in. If you believe that local and national ownership is one of the critical ingredients for moving towards peace and stability, you need to have baked into that through survey mechanisms, through the kinds of programs that engage people in conversations, in being a part of the accountability systems. You need to have that baked into your programs. And so I do think that's an important part of it. On the whole of government training proposal, you know, this is a real conundrum for us because there are currently some programs, the 1207 funding mechanisms that are designed exactly to do that, to take advantage of DoD resources for the purposes of use by state and USAID for various programs. The concern is that inevitably, and it's understandable, it's not a critique of DoD, but it's your money. You're going to want to know what happens to it. You're going to have oversight of it. Pretty soon it's a DoD program. And so, and it's an expensive workaround ultimately for the taxpayers. And so one would hope that if we all agree that those are needs that are best served, that serve the overall agenda, that there might be a way to have co-ownership, co-design, something that takes it out of only a DoD lens, not to diminish in any way the many, many lessons and systems and the planning capacities that DoD has, but to take it out of a wholly owned DoD enterprise and create more of a partnership. The NGOs have worked a lot with the military over the last decade. I think, in any really tough environment, who's out there? You've got the military, the journalists, and the NGO workers. And so just by virtue of being there together, we've learned a great deal about how to operate effectively, how to understand each other's language and systems. We also have learned there's an insatiable appetite among the military for training. We get invited all the time to participate in training, and we simply cannot keep up with the appetite. So there's also a need to develop ways of doing training that doesn't require endless individual. What are some more efficient mechanisms, distance learning, videos, et cetera, that enable that imbalance of just personnel time to interact with one another effectively?
Jean-Marie, there were several questions headed your way.
Yes, on the how can the U.S. operate in a broader context, I would second what Jim said. I'd say two things. One, in the way one develops training, in the way one develops identification of personnel, more engagement with the various actors who do the same. Other countries, organization, World Bank, EU, so that what is done in the U.S. is compatible with what is done by other actors. The other thing that I would say on that is that if it is accepted that helping fragile states recover has become a strategic issue, I don't think we should think of the personnel as a kind of afterthought. I mean, when defending the border was the strategic issue, there was a draft, there was a whole mobilization of the country. But for this very difficult exercise of getting involved in the life of another country, we sort of scramble to master the resources. I personally believe that it would be quite useful to rethink, for instance, the way the civil service is organized, to see that for the careers of some civil servants, when they have the right expertise, it would make sense and it would be an added value to their career to spend a year in some difficult place, which would fit with what I said when, say, we need not just experts, but we need operators. So someone who is you have to establish a little customs office in Congo. I mean, you don't need a great expert on Congo. You don't need a great expert on customs. You need someone who knows, considering the number of trucks who go through that place, how many customs officers do I need? And how am I going to organize it so that the various employees don't pocket the duties? It's very practical things. And it's an interesting experience. You need those things. So one has to think how one reorganizes a domestic service for international engagement. On feedback, I think the area where there has been the best use of feedback is rule of law. Certainly we don't do police today the way we would have done it 10 years ago. There's still a long way to go. But there is an understanding that today there is a need to have a much more comprehensive approach, as I said, that combines police, judiciary, corrections, civilian and uniformed personnel. I don't think we have had the same feedback in terms of local administration. I think there we can do much more progress. On finance, on budget, what I meant there is that if the state doesn't pay the police officer will prey on the population. That happens everywhere. And so this is a really fundamental issue. And there you have to fix the key financial structures of the state so that there is a minimum of transparency. Because not only if you don't do that, the security forces, instead of being a reassurance to the people, will be perceived as a threat, but also because of the lack of transparency, that will feed all sorts of suspicions and conflicts in the country that you want to move away from conflict. So it's a major political stake to establish financial procedures that are simple, transparent, and effective. And that requires some expertise. It can't be improvised.
Thank you. I'll go back to the floor now. I think there may be a few more hands raised. There were a couple in the back. Again, keep it short and indicate your name. And if you have a specific addressee, why indicate that, please.
Hi, my name is Jawad, and I'm a policy analyst on strategic economy. And my question is in regard to the foreign aid, how much of it is being spent on the ground and how much of it goes to the contractors and so on. There was a study done by Oxfam in Afghanistan, and they concluded that of each dollar given to Afghanistan, about 65 cents of that dollar goes to contractors and other people who work on the ground. How do you think we can come up with a system that increases efficiency and allows the money to be spent on the ground and not be taken back from the country that it's supposed to help? Thank you.
Okay. I have a question right here. If we get a mic up here, there's a couple up in the front. Right here.
Thank you. Eric Cohen, Investors Against Genocide. Sudan's a particularly difficult place in many ways, but I'm interested if you could share with us your views, maybe several of you could speak to it, on how we've been doing and what we could be doing better to develop civilian capacity in South Sudan, at least where we have access, and possibly in other parts of Sudan.
Okay, there's a question in the middle here. Yes, sir, stand up. Yeah, you. Yeah.
My name is David Steele. I just returned 2 weeks ago from Iraq, where I've been a reconciliation facilitator for the U.S. Institute of Peace. And previously I'd worked as a program manager for Mercy Corps, also training Iraqis from the southern part of Iraq. My question is, I'd like for a number of you to address what is the special role of government versus non-government agencies in terms of effectiveness? I have my own opinions on that, but I'm not going to express them, having worked in both sectors, having been embedded for a while with a PRT in Saladin province in Iraq working for USIP. I can see pluses and minuses in both cases, but I'd like you to address, if you can, what's the specific role that the non-governmental organization can function in versus the specific role that's an advantage for government agencies?
Okay, thank you. There's a question back there. Yes, sir. Stand up, please, and you'll get a mic.
Thanks. I'm Rick Hill. I'm with RTI International. This is actually a facet of one of the questions that was just asked and has to do with civilian capacity. I note that this discussion has all been about international civilian capacity, and it's and I appreciate Nancy's comments about the need to build constituencies for stability and the focus on the community. At what, and also vis-a-vis security, the fact that ultimately most of the work gets done in a place like Iraq by civilians who are not international. So I think it's worthwhile. I'd like the panel's comments on a slight strategic shift that has to do with emphasis on building indigenous civilian capacity as quickly as possible, and that sort of remote management via that Nancy mentioned.
Thank you. I think I'll have to close it there because we have to end this session at around 4:15, and I have a couple of questions of my own to add to the list. One thing that I'm deriving from this discussion is that we need to be training people at many different levels for many different kinds of disciplines, ranging from field people who need to understand how to negotiate and put out a local fire to people who might be called the managing intervention czars. Well, let's call that the Jim Dobbins track. To people who set up the UN clustering in the field, we'll call that the Jean-Marie Gaheno track. And then we have all the field people and the non-official people who have to work with the official people. We'll call that the Nancy Lindborg track. We're going to have a lot of tracks and quite a broad school of professional training before we're done. So that's my impression. I throw that out for comment if any of our panelists have a different view. The question also that I wanted to raise is what is the role in terms of civilian capacity building, not of the non-official sector, we've talked about that, but of the private sector, and what is rightfully outsourced, and should the private sector be part of the training programs that we're talking about here in setting up this School of Professional Training at USIP. So with that, I think I'll turn to you first, Nancy, because a lot of those questions were aimed at you.
Thanks, and God, I've never having a track, it would be fabulous. You know, actually, I think all four of the questions blend very closely together in terms of how do you get the cost of foreign aid that flows outside a country to reverse, how do you build civil society and capacity in South Sudan and the roles of NGOs. By the way, hi, David. Good to see you again. And Rick Hill's question. You know, I think it goes to what I was calling local ownership, which is also local capacity. And the faster you capacitate and support and catalyze people to organize for the change that they want to see, and then catalyze those economic opportunities to sustain those changes, I think the faster you move on a trajectory towards stability and recovery. And so a lot of a goal of NGOs versus governmental roles, I think, is that, and being able to do it in a way that is outside the wire. And it absolutely matters if you can sit and have a cup of tea in a community without having shooters in uniforms around. I think it provides a different kind of possibility for recovery and movement, and to negotiate, in the case in Iraq, with you know, the Hakim folks and the Sistani folks and the Sadr folks, because you have to be able to move around more freely often than government actors can, and do so in a more flexible and fluid way. In Sudan, you know, that is such a devastated place with, so the people who never left to go into the refugee camps had very little opportunities for education or understanding even of what a government looks like with any kind of accountability. So there's, I think, a lot of just basic development work that is going on there to help people organize, understand what that looks like, you know, in addition to basic literacy and kind of basic civic literacy are essential ingredients, you know, along with all the political negotiations that are going on. The issue of foreign aid and the study that Oxfam did, you know, I do think that there is an over-reliance on contractors who go in as advisors making extraordinary amounts of money vis-a-vis their local counterparts for too long. Not that there's not a role and a need for that kind of expertise and technical transfer, but in Kosovo, for example, we saw that continue for years and really squash a lot of the local capacity and not do a fast enough handover of that. So again, it's less about the doing it and more about the training to do it. And actually, Kosovo stands as one of those places where I think we did not learn that lesson fast enough and can. The challenge, of course, is how quickly you start those aid flows directly to the government. And this is a point of debate in Afghanistan right now, because as you flow the money into the government, which you want to do, and you want to capacitate the government at both the national and municipal levels, how do you match the resource flows with the capacity? Because otherwise the money's just getting bollocksed up at various critical points. So it's a delicate balancing act, and it goes to my earlier comment of you need to have those tracking, the local, the national, you know, the top, the bottom, all those tracks going from the earliest stages instead of starting with the national and assuming that it will flow out, because then you're not going to move quickly enough with being able to bring those flows into the government.
Thanks. Well, it would be nice if aid were less tied. That is, if there was less of a legal or practical requirement for aid to flow through national contractors. But the unfortunate fact is that the contractors themselves are a major constituency for the aid. And if you denied them access to it, you'd lose the constituency and you'd probably lose a lot of the aid. So there is a certain dilemma there. Similarly, it would be better if more of the aid were delivered in the form of budget support. That is, the money was just transferred to the indigenous government with some degree of oversight to make sure that it was spent reasonably, but was spent through the indigenous government. Aid agencies don't like that because they prefer to have the money themselves and conduct the programs themselves. And so you have the same problem of losing a major constituency to the extent you force that kind of diversion. Nevertheless, these are both worthwhile things to do. You just have to understand the trade-offs and the sources of resistance. On the role of government versus NGO, I think this is skewed, and Nancy's already alluded to this, in these circumstances where there isn't adequate security. All NGOs, or nearly all NGOs, are operating with government money as contractors or as grantees. But in a situation in which civilians have to live in military caserns, wear helmets and flak vests, travel in military convoys, and behave in all intents and purposes as if they're soldiers, the marginal utility of using civilians goes way down. It doesn't go down to zero, but it goes down. The ideal circumstance is where the military establishes a secure environment in which the civilians can circulate reasonably freely, in which the government representatives oversee the execution of programs, and in which either NGOs or for-profit contractors actually execute the programs, whatever they are. I mean, that's the ideal division of labor. As to the issue of the private sector, if you mean elements of the private sector that aren't simply operating off the public trough, that is, they're not just contractors to the government, but others, I think the basic answer is that until you establish security and some reasonable level of stability, you're not going to get investment. You're not going to get international investment. You're not even going to get local investment in significant levels. And so for that initial period, other than bringing in private sector as contractors to aid donors, I think there's only a limited role for them.
Thank you. Jean-Marie? Well, I would say we're often pursuing two objectives that in a way are contradictory. We want quick results, and we want national, local ownership. And to have quick results, very often it's better to have some international contractor that dumps something, and there are good reasons to want that, but there are bad reasons too, because the donors want to show that their money has produced something quickly. So there's a trade-off there in how much you want to really build in the national and the local structure, how much you want to show quick impact. And I think we often do not accept to be maybe a little less visible, but with deeper results. Private sector, agreed with what Jim said. On the local private sector, I would add that in a post-conflict environment, it's highly politicized. The people that are hired will belong to this group, that group, and so you have to know where what you're doing there. Otherwise, you can be. You think there's that market which is independent from the politics of the country. That's a complete illusion, and so you have to know where you operate. Thirdly, I would mention one program which. And just to stress that there's no silver bullet. That has worked, in my view, reasonably well in Afghanistan. That didn't work at all in Timor, which is National Solidarity Program, which, in essence, a World Bank program, where the World Bank would put money with the Ministry of Rural Development, which would then be allocated to self-defined local communities, and it would kill several birds with one stone. It would empower a national structure at the national level. It would create grassroots democratic communities, and at the same time it would identify needs that correspond to the real needs. It has worked more or less, I think, rather more than less in Afghanistan. So there are ways to involve the people with not too much overhead and money flowing outside. But I think we have to be aware that there will always be trade-offs.
It would be very difficult to imagine a richer conversation about all these issues. I think we've run out of time, but I wouldn't try to summarize this very rich discussion. I would say that one conclusion I reach is that there's going to have to be lots of tracks and lots of levels of training in our future training institution. Another conclusion I reach, and I think I sense this from both the questions and from the panelists, is that this business of being involved in various ways in countries that are fragile and in transition is going to continue for a while. This is not an area that's going to suddenly cease to be an area of demand and activity. It may be, as Jim Dobbins has said, that the way we did it in Iraq may not be repeated, but there are going to be lots of demands for this kind of involvement in parts of the world. I'm assuming that I'm speaking for the panel when I say that. So this is an area of continuing need and continuing importance for building up civilian capabilities. I'd like you all to join me in thanking our panel for their comments.